morning. My name is Pastor MERRITT Robinson. I'm the senior pastor here at Infinite Christian Fellowship, and welcome to our Sunday morning service. This morning we are going to start a new series. And that series is going to be focused on the book of Daniel, so Old Testament. And so welcome you, and hopefully you'll enjoy the series as we go forward. This morning we'll specifically be in Daniel chapter 1. And in this series, the kind of the focal point of, or if I could say the main theme that we want to get out of this particular book is commitment to God, and how we can be committed to God as we go through circumstances, situations, and trials that we experience on our everyday lives. And so, again, this series is going to be focused on committed to God. One of the things that we must understand about the world that we live in is that God is sovereign and He reigns supreme. He always has reigned supreme. And so He is supreme and in control always and forever. And there has not been a time, nor will there ever be a time, in which God is not sovereign. If we go back and look at the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 1, it indicates the sovereignty of the Lord. It says this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. Speaking of the creation, the beginning of what we know as the cosmos. But God was there creating and molding and shaping. He was in control at that particular time. If we go forward and move to the New Testament, in the New Testament it indicates, and this is from John, in John chapter 1, John says this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being by Him. And apart from Him, nothing came into being that was come into being. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that word speaks of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was in the beginning. He is divine. He was there when all things were created and leapt into existence. He was there in the beginning. And so God has always been sovereign and in control. And He's been in control of all things. Now, if we look at the world that we live in, sometimes we think to ourselves, but it does not seem like God is in control. It doesn't seem that God has everything handled. But we need to understand that He does. But there are times where we, His people, and individuals in general, there are times where we go through things. There's circumstances and situations that we experience, and it makes it seem like, wait a second, why am I going through this? And secondly, it does not seem like God has everything handled, that everything is in control. And we need to understand that we will experience that. We will have to wrestle and contend with some things. This is part of the human existence. Paul even stated that we must wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers and authorities. But we at times must also wrestle and contend with real people in the natural realm. And as we wrestle and contend, here's the thing that we must understand is that we must stand firm against those who stand in opposition to the will of God. We must say that we are going to stand firm. You might think that, again, what you are doing is right in the sight of the Lord, but if you are in opposition to the Lord and to His kingdom, then as Christians, we need to stand in line with the Lord and stand against those who oppose the Lord. And so there are times where we must wrestle and contend with opposition. But here's the thing, I'm not too concerned. And you might say, why? Because I know the Creator. I know the beginning from the end. I know the one who is able to put all opposition in check and place them under His authority. See, Jesus, my Lord, has defeated all opposition and enemies on the cross. Thus, if I rock with Jesus, then I know that I am good. But here's the other thing. We must also understand this as well, that if we are going to be committed to the Lord, we need to understand that God desires his people to have an exclusive relationship with him. When God talks about being jealous for his people, he is speaking about a jealousy, not in the natural form where we think of envy, or when people are jealous about who you are or what you have done. Not that type of jealousy. The jealousy that God has for us is that he wants to have an exclusive relationship with you. He doesn't want anything else to take that place of him. And so he is looking for an exclusive relationship. He's not looking for a relationship where you keep him as a quote unquote side piece. You think about, I remember, guys that I went to college with, or when we were younger, they would have like their main girlfriend. And by the way, I wasn't like this. I had one person, my wife, Carolyn. But there would be guys, they have a main girlfriend, and then they would have like a side piece, like another girl on the side. And see, God is not looking for you to place him as a side piece, as just one of many. He wants you to have an exclusive relationship with him. And so as we go through this book, the overarching understanding that we should take from this book is this: that if we're committed to God and remain committed to God, he will take care of us and bring us through the things we experience. He never stated, though, that life would be easy, but he did say that he would be with us and help us through circumstances. And so as we look at this series, again, committed to God, one of the things that we'll note in this very first chapter is if we're going to be committed to God, we need to refuse to compromise. We need to refuse to compromise. And so join me in Daniel chapter 1. And let me give you a little bit of the setup here before we get into the main text. If you think about the nation of Israel, at this point in time, the nation of Israel is really split into two kingdoms. You had the northern kingdom of Israel and then the southern kingdom of Judah. And see, God has sent prophet after prophet to warn the nations, the kingdom of Israel and Judah, to stop sinning, to stay committed to him and only him. But the people would not. And so God used foreign nations to, in essence, to spank, to discipline the nations or the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And so first God sent Assyria. Assyria was the kind of the ruling power at that time, around 722 BC. He sends Assyria to the northern kingdom of Israel by storm, and they take the people and put them into bondage. They completely destroy that kingdom. Now, the southern kingdom is still in play, though, the kingdom of Judah. And God is sending prophet after prophet, warning them, please turn to me, be committed to me. And yet they did not take the example from their brethren up in the north in regards to staying committed to the Lord. And so they too decided that they would turn from God. And so what God does is he sends another kingdom. At this time, it's the Babylonian kingdom. And the kingdom of Babylon comes around 586 BC and destroys the southern kingdom of Judah. And then what they do is they start deporting individuals from Jerusalem to the Babylonian capital. This is where we find ourselves right now as we begin the study in the book of Daniel. And so Daniel chapter 1, committed to God, refused to compromise. And in verse 1, it states this: in the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Verse 2, the Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Verse 3, then the king commanded his palace master, Ashpenaz, to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and water. And they were to be educated for 3 years, so that at the end of time, at the end of that time, I should say, they would be stationed in the king's court. Now, among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. And then the palace master gave them other names. Daniel, he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah, he called Shadrach. Mishael, he called Meshach. And Azariah, he called Abednego. And so at the start of Daniel chapter 1, we see these 4 Hebrew boys. We often, note them as Daniel, and then the Babylonian names that were assigned to them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But their real names were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those were their Hebrew names. And so, at the beginning of this chapter, one of the very first things that we should know, and it is interesting, the very first thing the Babylonians did was to take young men from their homelands and then have them go through this process of reprogramming. Now, in the 1930s and 1940s, get a little history lesson here. As Germany and the Nazi Germans were trying to take over Europe, one of the things they would do is the exact same thing that the Babylonians would do. They would go in and they would take these young people from Poland or France or from different countries, and what they would try to do is reprogram them or Germanize them so that they would forget their nation and more specifically their tongue and culture. And so Germans would alter also their names and make them similar sounding German ones. And so what Germany was doing was the exact same thing that the Babylonians were doing. They were taking young people, compelling them to learn German, to learn German culture. Now, if those individuals did not succumb or turn or try to learn German, what would happen is they would be beaten if they persisted to speak their native tongue. And so the Germans did some horrific things, obviously. But in this attempt, what they were trying to do was brainwash children so they would assimilate and become as German as possible. Babylon is doing the same thing. They are going through their own reprogramming system. They're trying to teach the young men the Chaldean literature and language so that they would what? So that they would forget Hebrew. They were providing them with royal rations of food and wine so that they would disregard their Hebrew diet. They were trying to re-educate them. They changed their names. And here's the thing, names are important. They are significant. They have meaning. There are memories and history associated with names. I think about the names of my own children, my 3 children. My oldest, his name is Micah Elijah. Micah means who is like God. Elijah means God is my God. My second born, her name is Kayla Adriel. Kayla means pure. Adriel means God is my help. My third born, my youngest, her name is Kira Rachel. And that word Rachel, or that name Rachel, I should say, it's the beloved wife of Jacob. And so if you look at all of their names, there's no just haphazard. We didn't just pick out their names. We didn't get a book and say, oh yeah, that name sounds good. No, we were intentional about the names that we were giving them. Why? Because as Christians, we wanted to give our children names that were associated with our faith and who we believed in and what we stood for. And so I remember when we used to tell people our firstborn, my son's name, Micah Elijah, people used to say, wow, that's a powerful name. Absolutely. But more than just being a quote unquote powerful name, we wanted him to be like God. We wanted him to know that God is his God. And so names are important. Well, you think about these four Hebrew boys, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Those names meant something in the Hebrew culture. That name Daniel stands for God is my judge, or also it means wise or wisdom. Hananiah means God has been gracious. Mishael means who is what God is. And sometimes it's actually translated who is like God. And then finally, Azariah, it means God is my help. And so each of those names for those Hebrew boys pointed to whom? Pointed to God. Their names identified the nature, character, and essence of the Lord. But the Babylonians, what they were doing was trying to change their names in an attempt to separate them from God and from their godly heritage. And it's even more wicked than that. What the Babylonians were also doing was providing them these foreign names, but they weren't just any old name, but names that were associated with Babylonian gods. Now, Belteshazzar and Shadrach, I don't know what those translate to, but Meshach, it actually translates to who is what Aku is. And Aku was a Babylonian moon god. Abednego actually means servant of Nebo. Again, another Babylonian god. And so what were the Babylonians doing in changing the names of these four Hebrew boys? They were disassociating these boys from their culture, but even more demonically stated, they were trying to separate them from Yahweh, telling them that you will now serve an idol or foreign god. That's what they were trying to do. That's what they were trying to get these boys to assimilate to. And so when we speak about being committed to God, the very first thing that Christians must do is to never allow yourselves to be separated from the things that define you as God's people. See, there's a Christian heritage, there's a Christian culture that we must hold tight to. We must hold tight to Christian practices, prayer and worship, Christian beliefs about who God is, about the Trinity, about the divinity of Christ, Christian values like love and forgiveness and humility, and traditions. For example, Christmas is coming up in another couple weeks. And so as we observe Christmas, what are we doing? We're not worshiping a tree, we're not worshiping presents, but we are worshiping Christ. We are remembering why it is that we celebrate this season. During this Advent, as we are moving closer and closer to Christmas, we are reminded about why it is that we take the time to celebrate. It's about Jesus and about what he has done for us so that we might be forgiven, so that we might be reconciled back to our Father. See, these are the things that make one a follower of Christ, a Christian. And so we must continue to do these things no matter where we find ourselves. Now, we are most likely not going to be transported from our homes or taken by a foreign entity. However, we might find ourselves in places or environments where the name of Christ is not welcomed or it is denounced. And thus we, the people of God, we must make a decision on how we will stand or represent Christ in those environments. So note how Daniel and his friends respond in the situation that they find themselves. Verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. So he asked the palace master to allow him not to defile himself. Verse 9. Now God allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. The palace master said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king. He has appointed your food and your drink. If he should see you in poorer conditions than the other young men of your own age, you would endanger my head with the king. And so this palace master, he's concerned about what? Himself. Listen, Daniel, I could care less about your diet. I could care less about what you want to eat and drink. Please, please take this food so that I don't get myself in trouble. But note, look what Daniel says at verse 11. Then Daniel asked the guard whom the palace master had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance with the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations and deal with your servants according to what you observe. So he agreed to this proposal and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was observed that they appeared better and fatter than all the young men who had been eating the royal rations. Verse 16, so the guard continued to withdraw their royal rations and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. And so what we see here, Daniel was committed to what? Not defiling or corrupting or polluting himself with the food of Babylon. He wasn't going to do anything that would bring corruption to his life. I remember, in my early days when I would, when I was working in corporate, many of the people knew that I was Christian. And so when we would go to corporate dinners, there would be, wine and alcohol flowing. And I remember, people like, hey, Mary, would you like a glass of wine? Or would you like an alcoholic beverage? Or would you like a cigar? And see, in those places and times, people, they kind of loosen up a little bit. And now, next thing you know, somebody's a little bit tipsy. And I knew that I was not going to put myself in a situation where I would compromise myself. I would not put myself in a situation where I'm getting twisted and making a fool of myself and a mockery of God. And so I stayed committed to my standards. Just like Daniel, I'm not going to defile or corrupt myself in front of you folks so that you can mock God. And so Daniel was committed to not polluting himself. Now, the servant in charge of the food, again, was afraid of the ramifications if Daniel and his friends did not eat the food. But here's what Daniel did. Daniel made a deal with the servant in charge. And he says, listen, give us 10 days of veggies and water, and let's see how we look compared to the other young men. And then as Daniel was doing this, God was also working. He was working behind the scenes. And the scripture says this, that God provided Daniel with favor and compassion with the palace master. And so Daniel was not only betting on himself, but he believed that God would sustain them. And so after 10 days, Daniel and the boys, they come back, they're examined, and they look great. They look fantastic. I can imagine Daniel saying, y'all need to get with this veggie diet that we are on. Because look at us. We look great. We look better than all the rest of you. And so Daniel decides, and the boys decide, that we are not going to do anything except what the Lord has called us to do. We're going to still maintain that standard. And so at verse 17, it goes further and says this, and to these 4 young men, God gave, note, knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. Daniel also had insight into all visions and dreams. And so God had given Daniel and the boys favor with the palace master, but then also he gives them knowledge and wisdom. And see, Daniel and his friends, they were committed to God, And because of their commitment to God, because they did not compromise, God provided them with all that they needed in the situation and circumstance that they found themselves. And he gave them knowledge and skill and wisdom and insight. And so going back to what I stated earlier about Germany and their reprogramming, what we found was that some of the young people that were coming to Germany to go through this reprogramming process, what they did was they actually took on the culture of the Germans. And so they left their Polish culture, or they left their French culture, and they submitted and succumbed to the Germans and what the Germans were trying to do. But there were some who stayed true to who they were. And despite the difficulties, they maintained their heritage and stated, we will never become German no matter what it means. This was the stance of Daniel and his friends. They would not renounce the Lord. I pray that we would do the same thing. In the world that we live in, there's going to be times where you are put into situations where you could potentially compromise. I hope that you will sit there and stand firm and say, you know what? I'm going to stand on the things that I know are right and true. I'm going to stand on the principles that God has given to me. I'm going to stand on what it means to be a person of faith, a follower of Christ. And so Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, they did not need the reprogramming of the Babylonians. They just needed to stay connected to whom? To God, the one who has wisdom and knowledge about all things. And so in verse 18, it states this, and at the end of the time that the king had set for them to be brought in, the palace master brought them into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among them all no one was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Therefore they were stationed in the king's court in every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired of them. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel continued there until the first year of King Cyrus. And so after this 3-year training program, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah were brought before the king for further examination. And note, the boys were found to be without any equivalence. They were superior to all parties. They were the stuff. And thus they were positioned in the king's court, and the king found them more reliable than any other advisors within the kingdom. Now that's favor. And so, no, they didn't have to compromise. They didn't have to change. They didn't have to go through that reprogramming or submit to it. They stood firm in who they were, and God elevated them even in a foreign land. And see, the reason why Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, despite being Hebrew and foreigners, were placed in the position of power and influence is because they stayed committed to God. See, for us, we can find ourselves in foreign territory, but we need to remember who we serve and whose we are, and know that God has our back no matter the place, circumstance, or situation. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it, but he does. And I'm reminded about a scripture in the Gospel of John. In John chapter 15, verse 4, Jesus said this, "Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as a branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless what? You abide in me." See, we need to stay connected to the vine. We need to stay connected to Jesus. Jesus is our source, our resource. And see, if we stay committed to God, refusing to compromise, he will stay committed to us, allowing us to thrive and succeed in any situation or circumstance. And so let us stay committed to God. May we not compromise ourselves.